Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about a different sort of topic than this channel usually covers, which is Warhammer the Old World. So, as some of you might know from one previous video I did where I basically stated that I would not be playing Old World, and I gave, the community my reasons why I wouldn't be doing this, I'm a little bit biased against this new game. Now, I love Warhammer Fantasy. I love the kind of era that it takes place in. I love the lore. I love the factions, and of course, I love the gameplay. Rank and file miniature combat was really cool and in a lot of ways really fun and really defined my early high school years when I wasn't playing 40K. I was, of course, playing Warhammer Fantasy, and some of my best memories, of course, of Warhammer in general are of those when I was leading my dwarfs into battle, especially when I was deleting dragons off of the board with my cannons. And let me tell you, there's no better feeling out there for a wargamer than being able to one-shot a dragon with a runic cannon. But as you guys know, GW cut support for their Warhammer Fantasy game because, quite simply, they didn't do a good job managing it and ran it into the ground. And yes, regardless of what some of you guys out there might say, it was GW's fault that Warhammer Fantasy died. The sales were bad because GW didn't do a great job managing the game and its rules, etc. So now that they've kind of reamped the game into Old World and they're going to be releasing Old World again, which is basically a reimagination of Warhammer Fantasy, a lot of people are getting back into it and a lot of people are really excited about it, which is fine. I think it's a good thing that people are excited about this game. It's, holds a lot of nostalgia for a lot of people, me included, and rank and file games are really fun to play. However, I do want to point out that regardless of how people feel about Old World or how excited they are, Warhammer Old World will fail if GW does not improve and fix the things that went wrong in their management of the game in Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. So, in this video, I'm not going to really go into the money stuff. I'm not going to go into the inaccessibility of the game and stuff like that. I feel like other people have already covered that side of the failure from GW's part. I'm going to go into why people stopped buying figures and really eventually got out of fantasy to begin with in 8th edition. And I'm going to be talking about the 5 problems that Warhammer Fantasy had in its rules in the later editions of the game. So without further ado, let us jump right into it and talk about the 5 things GW needs to fix in order for Warhammer Old World to be successful. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about in today's video. I'm going to be briefly discussing my experience with Warhammer Fantasy. I'm going to be talking about the 5 main issues with previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy that broke the back of the game for casual and competitive players. And lastly, the stakes of not fixing these issues when it comes to Old World. So let's go ahead and take it back about 15 years ago when I really first started getting into Warhammer Fantasy. For me, this was about 7 years after I started playing 40K, so by this time I was already a decent Warhammer 40K player. Wasn't the best, but was decent at the game, knew the rules and stuff like that. However, I was looking for something a little bit different, something a little bit new, and I decided to go with Warhammer Fantasy because there was a particular faction in which I really wanted to try out because I really enjoyed their aesthetic, and that was the dwarves. I was a big Lord of the Rings fan. I loved Lord of the Rings growing up and stuff like that. And I really loved, most of all, Gimli and the dwarfs. They were my favorite characters by far in Lord of the Rings. So when it came to Warhammer Fantasy, I absolutely had to play the dwarfs. And of course, they had some of the coolest looking stuff, in my opinion, in the entire game. Cannons and organ guns and all sorts of cool stuff. And of course, gyrocopters and the old metal ones were just absolutely impossible to build and put together. But, those are really cool. And I played from about 6th edition through 8th edition. So I kind of got on to the latter end of Warhammer Fantasy, the late Warhammer Fantasy, when Warhammer Fantasy really wasn't doing that great. And at that point was a much less popular game than Warhammer 40K. However, it was a really fun game that I enjoyed immensely. But throughout my years playing, I did notice some glaring and legitimate balance issues as I became a more experienced player. They weren't apparent to me at the beginning because I really didn't know the rules and I really didn't know how to move my units around and stuff like that the most efficiently. But when I did get better at the game and I started learning the rules and playing games against more experienced players, I started to notice some issues, to put it lightly. And, years later, after playing for several editions, after 8th edition, GW, as you guys all know, canned the game abruptly instead of fixing the issues that were making it unpopular. And these were issues that were pretty well spoken in the community. The community had issues with these kind of interactions as well. They voiced their interactions to GW over the years, but GW really didn't listen to the community at that point, and it's a much different landscape gaming-wise than it is now. Nowadays, GW tries at least to actively listen to the community when talking about certain rules interactions and stuff like that, and they actually do try to balance their games. Back then, however, it was not the case, and Warhammer Fantasy was wildly unbalanced for a large part of its existence. So as far as the rules go for Warhammer Old World, there needs to be basically 5 things that GW needs to fix from their previous iterations of Warhammer Fantasy in order to basically not fail and succeed as a game, which I would love to see. I would love to see Old World, actually succeed. I'm not a hater. I don't want it to fail. I personally won't be investing in it just because of my past experience, but that doesn't mean that other people can't enjoy it. And if you're one of those players that's really looking forward to Warhammer Old World, this isn't me hating or trying to, make the game bad or trying to ruin the game at all for you. That's not what this is. I'm trying to, kind of make it clear to the community what the problems were so that if they notice those problems occurring in Warhammer Old World, they can, actually voice that to GW so that they can fix it. And basically, really what it is we just don't want history to repeat itself, right? We don't want Warhammer Old World to fail like Warhammer Fantasy failed, and for GW to can Old World as well. So in my humble opinion, having played the game for a while, I wasn't an expert or anything by any stretch of the imagination, but I was a decent player at the game. These are the 5 problems that they need to address in the rules for Warhammer Old World to be successful and have long-term success. So the first thing is magic needs to be properly balanced. Transparency needs to be applied to everything in the game. Shooting needs to be simplified. Leadership and routing mechanics need to be less extreme. And lastly, the missions need to be well designed for all factions and not just a couple of them. Okay, so let's start off with a big one, which is magic, right? Magic has always been a huge part of Warhammer Fantasy, but it has a weird reputation in Warhammer Fantasy battles. And I think GW knows this. This is something that the community addressed with them several times over the years, and it's something that I think they're finally going to try to take seriously. And basically what it was is that in past editions of Warhammer Fantasy, magic was either useless or incredibly OP. In 8th edition, magic was one of the most OP mechanics in the entire game, bar none, and there really wasn't a lot that other factions could do against magic. Except, of course, bring their own overpowered magic to the battle, which, every faction mostly that could cast magic had access to some pretty OP spells. Of course, aside from the dwarves that didn't have any access to magic at all and really didn't have any real kind of magic resistance to negate any of the spells that were cast against them, in 8th edition that is. So when I'm talking about OP, I'm not just talking about slightly strong. I think we use that word very liberally now in 10th edition 40k and even in 9th edition 40k. And a lot of the times, when we look at tournament results and things like that, we'll consider the top faction OP, like maybe Eldar has a 57% win rate or a 56% win rate, which is like 1% above the threshold, to get a nerf essentially. And we'll say, well, that faction is OP or whatever, right? And yes, that faction may be strong, but the kind of OP I'm talking about isn't, 1 or 2 percentage points stronger than the rest. What I'm talking about is the ability to basically delete units wholesale from the game without much effort whatsoever. And that was basically magic in a nutshell in 8th edition. There were a lot of spells in the game at that time that could realistically take out your unit from, a 40-man block of dwarfs down to a maybe 5 or 10-man unit. Could easily take out 30 dwarfs in one round, which essentially destroyed your entire unit because, if you had a unit of 10 dwarfs left, it wasn't going to be that effective on the battlefield for the most part. It was going to lose in combat to nearly any other unit in the game. And a vast majority of factions could do this realistically 2 to 3 times per battle. So just completely eliminate a unit from the game 2 or 3 times per battle. And there was battles that I witnessed where spellcasters were just going back and forth, picking a unit up every single turn, for the most part. It oftentimes wouldn't be the whole unit, but it would be like the entire unit minus a couple of ranks of troops, which was, basically the whole unit. On the other end of the spectrum, I remember before 8th edition, 7th edition was, for some factions, really hard to cast magic. There were only certain factions that were good at magic, like High Elves and maybe Wood Elves in certain circumstances, but a lot of factions just didn't have super strong magic, especially if you were fighting dwarfs. And even though back then I was a little bit biased, I do have to admit, it would be pretty frustrating if I spent, 300 points on a wizard, and my wizard didn't do anything all game because the dwarf player was stacked with runes of spellbreaking, which pretty much just automatically shut down spells whenever they were cast. And it had unlimited range and, of course, could be used multiple times throughout a battle. So, that was a little bit silly too, obviously, and I don't think that's a good way to balance it either, where, you go up against a player and they're not able to cast any magic whatsoever. So you had these kind of two extremes fighting against each other. And to give you a good example of this, there was something in 8th edition called Irresistible Force. And this is really what made magic so impossible to deal with, is because you had a power pool of magic dice that you could use, and you could throw basically as many dice at a spell as you wanted. On double sixes, it would be called Irresistible Force, which meant it could not be stopped. It could not actually be dispelled. And this is really what made magic so impossible to deal with in 8th edition, because there was no realistic way to stop certain spells from going off, and these certain spells were so devastating that they would, again, like I said before, destroy your entire unit. Miscasts, on the other hand, also need to be less punishing in turn. So miscasting is one of the worst feelings in any game, especially when you lose your model because of it. So although I do think there needs to be some sort of miscast, effect, I don't think you should just outright die from it, which was a lot of what was happening in previous editions as well. Now, I have seen some of the things that GW has said they're going to do with magic, and I do think they're going in the right direction with it. Being able to basically cast the spell per wizard you have, I think, is a good way to balance it. However, you do also need to limit the number of wizards you can take. If an opponent is fielding like 5 wizards or something like that of different lore types and stuff, and even though the effects might be a little bit less, it's not going to matter if you have 5 or 6 wizards on the field all casting 1 or more powers, right? Because eventually it's just going to equate to the same thing, which is you're going to be picking up units turn after turn. So I obviously think there does need to be some sort of limit on the number of wizards or spells you can cast in a single turn. Also, there needs to be a meaningful difference between low-level and high-level wizards and their capabilities. This is something that 8th edition really didn't do well. There was a good chance, most of the time, that a low-level wizard could do the same exact thing as a high-level wizard could if you had enough power dice in your magic pool. Spell effects also need to be scaled appropriately. There can't be, spells that just automatically delete a unit. It needs to be balanced with the points cost of the wizard and things like that. It also looks like, from what we've seen so far, magic is looking better, but time will tell in the coming weeks. So GW has said they aim to improve magic, but again, they said some similar things with Warhammer 40k 10th edition. They did fix a couple of things. There were some things about 40k 10th edition that were really good. There was also some things that were a little bit imbalanced that they needed to rewrite and fix. So we'll just have to wait and see on what magic looks like in the old world, but it is something that they have to tone down considerably, but also at the same time allow it to be impactful and fun for everybody involved. The next, and probably one of the most important things that needs to be addressed with the old world, is transparency. So in past editions, there were secret items, abilities, and units that you did not have to tell your opponent about, and in fact, you were encouraged not to. And this was really problematic because oftentimes this would mean the difference between victory and defeat, but not in a legitimate way, more of like in a cheap gotcha way. So examples of this being the Goblin Fanatics, Assassins, and certain item effects that activated when you did something without you knowing it. So for example, accepting a duel with your Chaos Lord against an enemy Empire captain, only to have your stats reversed due to the Van Horseman speculum. And of course, if you had known that, you probably wouldn't have accepted the duel in the first place or even declared a duel, knowing that, the enemy character had that. So this led to an extreme amount of gotcha moments throughout the game that gamers have typically hated in any game system, not just Warhammer Fantasy. So this is really something that needs to be applied in Warhammer Old World. Every single unit must have their items listed, and you should have access to knowing which characters have which items, which units have assassins in them, which units have goblin fanatics in them, so you can plan and strategize accordingly. And this is just a quality of life thing that I think is just good for the game in general. There's no reasonable expectation for every player in the game to know every single army and every single unit and every single ability. These things should be transparent to all players. The next thing on our list is that shooting needs to be simplified. So some of you guys may be thinking, well, what was wrong with shooting in Warhammer Fantasy? Well, for one, it was extremely hard to actually get any unit to shoot. Let me give you an example. In past editions, you can only shoot in 2 ranks normally, with some exceptions. Certain weapons like longbows and stuff could fire more shots, but oftentimes you weren't able to fire everything. And in addition, units that were in front of them blocked line of sight. So what would often happen is you would want your ranged units behind shooting over your melee units, but you couldn't really do this in practice because you would never be able to shoot in these scenarios. Unless you were shooting at something with the large trait. So unless you were shooting at something like trolls or centaurs or, Ragnarok spiders or giants or something like that, you typically would have line of sight blocked. And this made it extremely difficult to justify taking most shooting units as they struggled to deal any significant damage and were often line of sight blocked. On top of this, certain units that could use volley fire or anything like that that could shoot over other units were often just weak. So your standard bow was basically a last gun, strength 3, AP nothing, not very effective against most enemy types. There were also a bunch of negative shooting modifiers, like a -1 to hit for over half range and stuff like that. And basically what that amounted to is ranged weapons were just not very effective in general, unless you were shooting something like a cannon or, a warp lightning cannon or a grudge thrower or some artillery piece. Your normal shooting units just were not going to be all that effective. And this was a real shame because there were some really cool shooting units out there like Thunderers from the Dwarves or Handgunners from the Empire that were really awesome, but you really realistically couldn't use them because shooting was so difficult. So another thing that needs to be simplified is shooting. All ranged weapons in a unit should be able to shoot, and similar or smaller units should not block line of sight. Obviously, if something is much bigger than you and it is standing in front of you, that makes sense. But if it's a similar size or smaller, then it shouldn't block line of sight, and you should be able to fire with every single model in the unit, regardless of how many ranks you have. I think this would be a fair way to justify the greater cost of ranged units in general, which we are almost certainly going to see because ranged weaponry in, a fantasy style battle is a good advantage to have. Leadership and routing mechanics also need to be less extreme. So this is another thing that really kind of broke the game for a lot of players and made a lot of players not really want to play Warhammer Fantasy. And every Warhammer Fantasy player has one of these stories, right? Where one of their units is forced to take a leadership check, that leadership check fails, and then that leadership is splashed onto other units that have to take leadership checks. They fail in turn, and your whole army ends up running off the board turn 1, and you lose the game before you can even do anything. Notoriously, Goblin armies or Skaven armies in the old days would be able to do this. Of course, the new Skaven in 8th edition were basically fearless. I will go into that in a second. But a lot of armies had leadership issues, and yeah, it was just not fun. It was not fun to lose an entire unit turn 1 because they failed a leadership check and ran off the board. And yeah, even though it didn't happen a lot, it happened often enough to be really annoying, and again, one of those really feel-bad mechanics. Another mechanic that was a little bit annoying was losing combat by a couple of points and then being run down as a result because it was so easy to achieve. You didn't have a lot of dice getting thrown out, so it was it was fairly easy to lose combat by 1 or 2 points in any given round. And after losing combat, having a really good chance of having your entire unit run down and destroyed was awful. And I think a pushback mechanic is better for units in general with 50% unit strength or above. So I don't think, any unit should just be able to run down a unit in combat automatically. I think there should be some sort of threshold for it. Like if the unit is big enough, maybe you take some casualties by, an enemy running down maybe the last rank or something like that. But, having your whole unit destroyed, including characters and everything, is a little bit too much. And it is definitely something I am glad that 40K got rid of. I'm also not a fan of units below 25% not being able to regroup, because there's a lot of armies out there with really elite units that even under 25% are really strong, and not being able to regroup except on double ones seems a little bit odd to me, especially since they recently announced that this was still going to be the case. So yeah, definitely not a huge fan of that, but hopefully there's some sort of caveat to this where units have a chance to actually get back in the fight without having to roll double ones. Missions also need to be well designed for all factions. The rulebook missions in 8th edition were an absolute nightmare, and a lot of them were pretty much impossible to win for certain factions in the game. For example, there was a mission to hold the tower in the middle of the board, and whoever got first basically won that mission. So any faction with fast units, or that got first turn, had a massive advantage. And I remember as a dwarf faction, it was basically impossible to win this mission. If I rolled it or my opponent rolled it, it was game over turn 1. Unless, of course, that opponent was also playing an army that could not get to the tower, in which case it was completely ignored. So it wasn't a good rule either way. Like in a game with Ogre Kingdoms that I had where he had no Noblars in his army. So he actually could not physically fit his models inside of the tower, so we just decided to ignore it and kill each other. And again, whatever system you're playing, missions should not be dependent on having a certain type of unit in your army, especially since the armies of Warhammer Fantasy are so different and so diverse from each other. And just to give you another example of how frustrating this could be, I was playing against an Orcs and Goblins player at one point, and we rolled this mission. Turn 1, he gets in the tower with a unit of Spider Riders, because Spider Riders had a special ability that allowed them to, go into towers and buildings and stuff like that. Whereas normally Cavalry could not do that. And essentially, it was game over right then and there. The tower rules basically prevented my dwarfs from now being able to attack him in the tower with any great success. I could destroy the tower with my cannons, but of course that would mean, turns and turns of shooting wasted on the tower instead of wasted on his units. Or used on his units, I should say, not wasted, because I definitely would have killed a few Arachnarok spiders. By the way, he was running 2 of them in this list. But even if I did manage to kill the tower, I would still have to have more bodies than him on the objective, on the ruins of the tower, so to speak. Which again was impossible because I was running dwarfs. So there was essentially no real way to win this game at that point, and, I basically just told him, well, you're probably going to win this, most definitely, but let's play this out anyway and just have some fun. And we did. It was a really fun game, a really awesome game. Was able to kill the Arachnarok spider with some cannons. One of my other characters was able to kill the other Arachnarok spider, which was a little bit of a gotcha moment, because again, back then you really didn't tell people about equipment or items or anything like that. So he had no idea my character had these items. In hindsight, this was kind of lame. My opponent definitely should have known that. But he also did the same thing to me on the opposite side of the battlefield with some Goblin Fanatics, which basically wrecked my Iron Breakers to a couple of dwarfs. And even though it was a crazy kind of battle that we both had fun in, the fact that the mission basically gave my opponent an auto victory from the beginning was very poorly designed, and I hope that in Warhammer Old World, the missions are actually balanced for every faction. So what are the stakes for not fixing these issues? Let's say, hypothetically, Old World comes out and all of these issues rear their ugly head. Well, simply put, Warhammer Old World will fail to survive after the initial wave of hype and nostalgia, and sales will plummet. And don't get me wrong, I want Warhammer Old World to be a success because I think this is a cool game. I'm not going to support it personally because of, kind of what GW did to Warhammer Fantasy and how they mismanaged that game into the ground. But I want Old World to be a success because I know a lot of players who really love Old World and really want to get back into the game. However, this is not going to be good for new players getting into the game who will become easily frustrated and lack the motivation to continue collecting. So imagine if your entire unit of High Elf Swordmasters or whatever you have gets deleted by a single spell from a level 1 wizard. Would that really incentivize you to continue playing knowing that your entire elite unit that you've spent probably hours building and painting just got deleted by a goblin with a mushroom in his hand? I don't think so. I think a lot of players would be rightfully frustrated at something like that happening. Of course, you are going to lose models throughout the game, and that's to be expected. But to lose an entire unit to Magic like that has always been something that has been extremely frustrating and demoralizing, especially for newer players, And when I was playing, I was already a veteran. I knew what to expect. It was lame and I didn't like it, but occasionally I did want to play Warhammer Fantasy, so I just kind of dealt with it, even though I knew it was a broken mechanic, and even though it wasn't very fun when it did happen, which was often against certain opponents. And I think I had a better time of it than most because, well, quite simply, I was a dwarf player and dwarfs had a little bit extra resistance to Magic than most factions. Competitive play will also get extremely hard to balance if the past mistakes of previous editions are not addressed. There's going to be less participation in these events, and eventually this will cause players in general to lose interest in the game. And when sales plummet, GW is going to do the same exact thing they did with Fantasy, which is basically they're going to update the game less, spend less attention on it, of course, and eventually, if it does poor enough, they will pull the plug on it. And really, we don't want this as a community. I don't want that. I don't want Warhammer Fantasy, Old World to fail. So what that means is GW does need to address these past issues that the game has had so that it can be a fun and enjoyable experience for all of those who get into it. What GW absolutely cannot do is stand on the laurels of nostalgia and hype to expect this game to be a success. They actually have to have well-written rules and a sustainable game. And lastly, I do want the community to keep something in mind. The other day, I was in the game store and a couple of people were talking about Old World. Actually, somebody in my group was participating in this conversation as well because he was, kind of an older Warhammer Fantasy player. And I just want to address this. It is not the community's fault Warhammer Fantasy was discontinued originally. The fault for Warhammer Fantasy's failure is completely on GW after years of failing to address the issues with the game that the community brought up. I know these issues were brought up continuously from basically the whole community, from casual players to very experienced players, and GW did not listen. In fact, I feel like personally they made a lot of money grab decisions near the end of Warhammer Fantasy that were completely unbalanced and really threw the game off even more. The amount of general codex creep that existed near the end of 8th edition with armies like Skaven coming out were absolutely ridiculous. And again, it was just an attempt to sell more models. It wasn't actually meant to balance the game or be good for its community. And the lack of purchases that ensued were due to these failures of, rule balance and game balance and nothing else. Do not let anybody guilt you into buying Old World miniatures if the issues of the past are not addressed. And I think my biggest issue with the argument that it was the community's fault for Warhammer Fantasy's failure is because it doesn't actually put any blame on GW's failures itself, and it just assumes that it was the community's fault for having a lack of interest and not GW's fault for producing that interest in the first place. So something along the lines of the Warhammer community better come out for this and better support this game, or else GW is going to can it again, and they better pull out their wallets basically for Warhammer Old World so that we can have this game system back. And what really frustrated me about that comment was it's not the community's fault that GW did such a bad job handling the game, and I wouldn't buy new models either if the game was handled that badly. So I don't think anybody really should. If they notice the rules are not good, they're playing the game, maybe they buy 1,000 points worth of models, they play the game, they don't enjoy it because the rules are unbalanced, maybe Magic is way too OP or whatever. The community and us as consumers have the right not to support a poorly designed game system. And that's just pure and simple, right? If you're not having fun with the game, why would you support it? And that's exactly what was happening in Warhammer 8th edition and in past editions of Warhammer Fantasy. It is up to GW to make a well-balanced and fun game. It's not up to us. We're the community, right? We're not the people making the money, designing the rules, designing the models, etc. We have a great love for the universe. We're all nerds here. We love Warhammer and we love the whole world that Games Workshop has created around Warhammer. But that doesn't mean we have to support every single thing GW comes out with if it's garbage. And to kind of give you guys a comparison, it would be kind of like if your favorite gaming company, like Bethesda, came out with a completely boring and trash game and expected you to pay full price for it and basically said, if you don't buy the game, we're not going to make any more of these. And that's just wrong from a consumer's point of view. I'm also a big fan of the Total War series and, strategy games like that. If Creative Assembly came out with a garbage game like Pharaohs, for example, and people didn't buy it, that's Creative Assembly's fault. It's not our fault as a community. So same thing goes with Warhammer. If Warhammer Old World tends to be a flop with poorly designed rules and designs, then that's exactly what's going to happen, right? The community is not going to buy into it, and it's not going to be the community's fault. It's going to be GW's fault. Having said that, I do want the game to be a success, and that's why I'm creating this video, because there's a lot of people in my gaming group who are going to enjoy Warhammer Old World, and I would very much like them to be able to enjoy the game and have a balanced and fun experience. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. I know this isn't my usual content. We will return to some Eldar or Dark Eldar content in the next day or two. I will see you guys next time, and thank you so much to my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow considerably. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated for my Patreon, and a free trial will grant you permanent access to our Discord community. And this is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts, including Dark Eldar players who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store through my channel store page, or you just want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon to help support the channel. I will leave those links in the description as well. Lastly, a couple of quick updates. I did post a community post on my channel a couple days ago talking about Eldar miniatures that I was selling to make room for a new channel project. If you guys are interested in that, you should check that post out. And lastly, I am almost done with the Eldar Knights index, or fandex, I should say, that is going to be, basically posted on the channel Discord within the next week or so as a rough draft. So I do also plan on doing a video on that and talking about the progress of the project. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.